Welcome to Audiogyan with Kedar Nimkar, a podcast that documents insightful conversations with Indian designers, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers and creatives of all types. Catch us on iTunes or visit audiogyan.com for more Gyan sessions. Here's your host Kedar Nimkar.
Vijay Tendulkar, born on 6th January 1928 and passed away on 19th May 2008. Tendulkar Sahab was, or should I call, is an unarguably a leading Indian playwright, movie and television writer, literary essayist, political journalist and social commentator. He's best known for his plays Shantata, Chalu Aahe, 1967, Ghāshirām Kotwāl, 1972 and Sakhārām Binder also in 1972. Welcome to Audiogyan Biographies. Today we'll be documenting Vijay Tendulkar with a bit of help from Ramu Ramanathan. Ramu is an Indian playwright, director with acclaimed plays to his credit. Ramu has previously been a guest on episode 29th of season 1. He spoke about Stagelife Characters, and Ramu is a go-to person to understand the tidbits of Indian theatre, so do give it that episode also a listen. So welcome Ramu sir, and actually welcome back, and thank you for giving your time. It's again like a real honor to have you on Audiogyan.
We must thank you, Kedar, for the work that you're doing in documenting some absolute gems. I've heard a lot of the episodes. Some of them are absolutely marvelous. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. I'm honored that you're listening to it. Yeah.
Sure.
So for the listeners, I have like 3 announcements before we start. So first is actually for you, Ramu. In my passion or say naiveness or ignorance I shall call, I've been thus interviewed legends like Makaran Sathe, Atul Pethe, Sunil Shanbag and few of the other stalwarts of theatre world. But I'm totally aware of my position, and it's purely like a role of a documenter and not really like a subject expert. So please excuse me for like naive questions in the flow if possible.
Sure.
Secondly, with the backdrop of current unrest in the country, this is for the listeners. We are documenting Vijay Tendulkar, who was a playwright who dares to speak uncomfortable truths. His remarks about politicians and indeed middle class society can make you uncomfortable. So please listen at your own will. Third and the last, again to the listeners, we'll try and document this in a 2-part episode. Part 1, which is this one, we'll try and ask few questions to set context to understand Vijay Tendulkar Sahab in a more human way and his work and his philosophies, which will be documented by Ramu Ramanathan. And in the second part, we'll sit back and listen to like a beautiful narration about theatre and violence, which is a piece which Ramu has written. So yeah, let's start. So Ramu sir, I want to understand, like I was very curious to know, and obviously my preliminary research found out that his writing was slightly different, especially when he started with Manus Navache Bait, Man is an Island. So was one of his first plays and was very remarkable. So people had never heard such dialogues on theatre. And also in our earlier episode, when I asked you what was happening during the different language from Shakespeare to the other places. So in that you mentioned that even the courtroom dramas were now coming to living room spaces. So the language change and things change. So you have any insight, why did Vijay Sahab or
Tendulkar Sahab.
Tendulkar Sahab started this sort of what were his influences, what was going around then?
So I think
that made him write?
2 or 3 things which in the case of any artist, we need to take that into cognizance. Number 1 is that he was not just a playwright, he was also a journalist. So one of the things that happens in journalism is, you're very familiar with Boli Bhasha, colloquialism. So the language that is spoken by the people he must be interviewing. So be it, police officers in police stations, politicians, what have you. So that is one part of it. So you're picking up sentences which are not necessarily literate in the truly refined sense of the term. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is that what you have to understand is that prior to Tendulkar Sahab, there was a huge tradition of theatre in Maharashtra itself. So if you look at the 2 major playwrights that emerged from Nashik, Kanetkar and Shirvadkar, and then a whole lot of other traditions that are there. The kind of plays that were transpiring or being staged in Shivaji and so on and so forth. To a large extent, even though they were living room plays and so on, one of the things with the language was, it was alankarik, what we would say, rhetorical. So formulations were necessary, either over-romanticized, over-lyrical. The sentences would be very grand, very, very pompous. There would be lots and lots of metaphors and visual imagery and so on and so forth. And that is a point of time when a very young Tendulkar sees this, and he is contrasting these two worlds. This world of journalism where he's hearing these half sentences, and he's hearing this language which he realizes nobody speaks like this anymore. The kind of conversation that you and I have today in modern society or anywhere else across Maharashtra, that nobody talks like this except for politicians on Republic Day, politicians on Independence, because that is the way you are expected to speak, right? When you're addressing the nation or when you're addressing a large gathering of 5 lakh people, 10 lakh people, at that point you're expected to be larger than life. You can't be obviously going into nitty-gritties of, GDP and those kind of things.
And sorry, in this, what he was observing, these long sentences and more flowery language, was it because of the subject also? They were like mythological subjects?
Not necessary. But that was the way people spoke. So, just to give you a reference, if you look at the old movies, say Prithviraj Kapoor, 1950s, 1960s, even if he's ordering or requesting his servant to get him a glass of water, he would do it in a tone which would be so bombastic, so rhetorical, so lyrical, it would not be done. So the whole nature of speech was, in that form. And then the third thing that happened, I will not say each of this is happened at the same point of time, but broadly, if you look at those 15-20 years, is, for example, the creation of something like Chabildas, which I think was the center point of everything good that transpired in avant-garde theatre or in that kind of modern. Now, Chabildas was, if you look at the geographical location, since you're also a Mumbai child, is probably about 1 kilometer away from Shivaji Mandir. So everything that the theatre within Shivaji Mandir stood for, Chabildas was an antithesis to that. So Tendulkar Sahab was also taking, in a way, not just Tendulkar Sahab, a whole lot of other playwrights were also taking panga with that kind of play. Now, for our viewers who are not familiar with what is the distinction between a Shivaji Mandir and a Chabildas, is Shivaji Mandir would be 1,000+ seater with a balcony, and till the mill strike of the 84, the balcony used to be booked first, and then the lower stalls and so on, where the more expensive tickets were. And this is a typical proscenium stage where you have audience facing you, and the play transpires. Actors typically would come to the edge of the stage and talk. So they had to be loud because acoustics were not very good, and then you had to make sure that the last person who's seated in the balcony can hear you. So necessarily a certain kind of theatre it had to be. You see, it had to be static, it had to be two-dimensional in that sense. And it had to cater to everybody, the sort of intelligentsia that sat in the first 5 rows, plus, of course, the people who sat in the back rows. So obviously, it started catering to a particular kind of audience, you see, and a lot of middle-class housewives. So Maharashtra is one of the few places where I think about 40% of the audience is women, which is an extraordinary thing. And this includes independent women who buy their own ticket and go and see a play, Today being International Women's Day, it's something that one must acknowledge. So Chabildas was diametrically the opposite of it. It was on the 3rd or 4th floor of a municipal school. It was a rickety space, it was a dingy space. But the thing was that instead of having a two-dimensional proscenium stage, you could play on all 4 sides. So it is what you call total theatre. So you could have audience on all 4 sides. The proximity at which you and I are seated today, sometimes the actor, you would have a Nasiruddin Shah or a Amrish Puri, seated as close or performing as close as this, and you're watching them. So they could actually afford to whisper. They could actually afford to turn their back to an audience and talk. So I remember at that point of time, when, say, a theatre unit, for example, when Dubey Sahab had staged some of these plays, one of the biggest complaints from the theatre-going audience was, this is not acting, and this was the era when Amol Palekar and Nasiruddin Shah and Amrish Puri were being born, right? So you had actors of that caliber now giving voice to these characters, all right? And the first reaction was, this is not acting. because they were accustomed to a Kashinath Ganekar, that style of Prithviraj Kapoor. So it was everything had, an actor had to behave like an actor, very bombastic, very, exaggerated.
Exaggerate, yeah.
So this was the big change. So one of the things about Tendulkar Sahab was he was always known as the playwright of the half sentence. And just to illustrate the point, I would say is that, for example, if I would be watching a play on Shivaji Mandir, there is a boy and a girl, and the boy is asking the girl out for a date. He would say something to the effect of, "Yete ka, apan जाऊ बाहेर चहा पियायला. हो, मी पण येते चहा पियायला. कुठे जाऊ आपण?" वगैरे. This kind of a thing. And a lot of things which we already know they are giving us through the information. Cut to Tendulkar, it would be येते, कुठे, चहा, चल, आता, नको. So this is now two characters talking to each other in just half words, but there is so much that is getting automatically implied, right? And then we realize what he's doing, because he's completing, you as an audience is completing the thought in a way. So this is, in a nutshell, what Tendulkar Sahab was attempting to do with some of the plays. Yeah.
But where did this influence come from? Was it like inherent observation and then like a voice, or was this happening somewhere other part of the world as well?
So other part of the world, he was, again, as you're aware, an extremely curious mind. So influences are multiple. Again, I'll give you an example because I think that illustrates it better. So there's another contemporary of Tendulkar called Arthur Miller, and I think they were in touch with each other. And that was, again, one other extraordinary thing which I found out later was he was in touch with about 5 or 6 of the major international playwrights of those times. And that's something, today, in spite of us being so globally interconnected, I don't know who my contemporary in Germany is. I don't know who my contemporary in the US is. But here was a man sitting here, right here in Parley East, connected with a Miller, connected with a Harold Pinter, connected with a Tom Stoppard, connected with a Václav Havel, and that is important. So Miller is an American, as you know, an American playwright, and like Tendulkar Sahab, he became larger than life as a playwright. And one of the things I think he realized at some point of time is that he's getting gradually disconnected with American society. All right. So he had written these great plays, Death of a Salesman and, Crucible and so on. Then there was that famous marriage with Marilyn Monroe and all that kind of thing. And then he realized that he was only moving around with the pastry crowd in the US. And he needed to gradually disconnect. So even when he used to travel to new cities, he would make it a point to stay in the dirtiest suburb of that city. So he may have a booking at the, Hilton or what have you, the presidential suite, but he would make it a point to go and stay in the Kamatipura of that city, for instance. So that was one thing. And the second thing that he started doing very gradually is he started listening to voices. And the same observation that Tendulkar had in his life as a journalist, that the language that we speak on a day-to-day basis is not the language that we are speaking on stage. So what Miller started doing is that in those days you had these Philips huge tape recorders, very bulky. Today you can record on mobiles and dictaphones. He started placing them at newspaper vendor stalls, as well as flower vendors near the subway stations. And he would come in the morning and just place the the recorder in that, because a huge population comes, stands there, has conversations and goes away. And then he would listen to those conversations, play back, and then pick up the notations, the tonalities, the words, the vocabulary, the linguistic patterns from those. 4 characters that he was. So he would then start imagining who these people were, and of course then start sketching out and etching out his character. So he very consciously made this sort of, you would almost call this a verbal workshop. You're like just randomly reading these recorders across various spaces and then trying to pick up these little bit of voice notations or what have you. Advantage in the US is, fortunately or unfortunately, it's a monolingual society, in the sense it's primarily English. So his work that way is easy. In our society, it's a little more difficult because we have so many. Officially, we have X number of languages, 108 languages, and unofficially we have about 1,000 odd different languages, right? So, but this is something that Tendulkar was trying to look at, that theatre ultimately is about language, and language is evolving, and how as a responsible playwright do I respond to that, and not just in stereotype cliches kind of. One is you just pick up one word, 2 words, and you can succeed. But if you're really doing a serious study of that language, then this is the manner in which they did it. So in the case of Miller, I think he was also trying to do it formally. It was an extension. In the case of Tendulkar, again, he would do it formally, but also informally in terms of, he was a great observer, a lot of things. So people say, so-and-so is a great mimic and so on. You keep hearing this about actors. Playwrights are also like that. They're great mimics, but they're great mimics of linguistic patterns and so on. So that was something that I think all good playwrights, all good writers aim to do.
I found this very interesting because you're also optimizing your time. You're keeping a recorder while you're also learning.
But you see, there's a problem in that. Playing back those tapes is a huge ordeal and listening to them. And then you have to be patient because those conversations are basically going nowhere. And that was again something I think one learned from Tendulkar. This was, I think, one of the conversations we had. He said that, you see, what happens is that we always assume conversations have a beginning, middle and end. You see, we are used to having a punchline, a thing. He says 99% of the time, a conversation has a beginning, a middle, and then it loops back to the beginning. It never has a conclusive end. We, in our sort of, what shall I say, myopia or our sense of self-importance, always conclude things, into mini chapters, mini anecdotes, mini units. He says life is not like that. Life is just a series of incoherent conversations, which basically go nowhere, you see. And it is our sort of false sense of pride that we believe that these conversations are leading up to something. And so somewhere, in his later plays, you see a lot more of that, where you see a little bit of fragmentation, the deconstruction of the language. And I think it's important. It's an important point that, that conversations ultimately go nowhere. So, and at the same time, you have to tell a story on stage or, represent a kathavastu. Otherwise, an audience will start, where is this going? I mean, they're not come to spend 2.5, 3 hours of, just nothingness in that sense. So, yep.
Very interesting because I want to highlight 2 points. So you said it not necessarily it loops back to the beginning, but in this format of, say, podcast or any other form where there's a broadcast happening, maybe it needs
a structure.
It needs a structure and then some takeaway. I don't know. If they are spending some time of there to listen to this, maybe that is required. But one thing which I want to tell the listeners is that if you play the 29th episode again, and I clearly remember I was interacting with you for the first time. And after the first question, you started as if there's a clear continuity in your mind because there was no okay, and then it was a start. It was not that way. You just started. So what happens is, and wo jo so tha, is there's a pre-dialogue which is happening in your mind. So I think this conclusive pattern, is it in small talks or because when you are having like a more detailed talk, then
but so again, a couple of things. The kind of conversation you and I are having on a Sunday morning, I'm sure there will be precisely 0.28% of the population doing this in this kind of a formal. This is a very formal structure. We have imposed a structure on a Q&A, right? And so we know there's a questioner, there's an answer that you are going to ask the questions I'm hopefully going to respond to. So there is a very, very definitive structure. We have a time constraint. All those factors are already built into this. So it is an artificial construct. But typically these would be conversations, like yesterday I went and met a school friend of mine who's down, who's suffering from cancer. And typically what happens in these hospitals is that you're sharing a room with somebody else. So while he was lying down and sleeping, I was reading something and there is a patient on the other side and I was hearing their conversation. Those conversations are going nowhere. It's between a mother and a son, and the son is taking care of the mother in the next cubicle. But so I heard about 4.5 hours of those conversations. I actually did not know A, what the relationship was, and B, where this, other than the fact that she is a patient, where's this gone? Because she would talk of Tukaram, she was talking of Dehu, that you should go there once. So if I didn't know that it was an elderly woman talking to her young son, and that she is a patient who has just been operated, I would really have no idea because there's a curtain in between, you see. So I would really have no idea. So as a piece of theatre, it was just marvelous. What is actually transpired? Who are these two people? If I listen to those 4 hours of conversation, in between the nurse would come, in between there would be food and, other things that would be there. So, right.
Wow.
Anyway, I think we've deviated from Tendulkar a lot,
And then what was happening in the 1960s to 1990s that Tendulkar wanted to express his thoughts through violence, because that we'll cover in the second chapter, but just to set context, and also from whatever like few interviews I've heard, I want to like consume a lot more about him. But he mentioned that he was like a really simple middle class man with like no big struggles. Obviously inherent internal struggles are different, but as a day-to-day life, it was a simple life going good. So where did this violence start?
So again, there are few. So violence is a separate aspect of it. One is, of course, as I mentioned, he was a journalist. Secondly, simple middle class life, yes, but huge amount of aspiration intellectually. Comes from a family of great intellectuals, Suresh Tendulkar. I mean, if you look at that family pedigree, it's immense. The kind of people he was surrounded with. So we are talking of someone who dealt with ideas. He went beyond the realm of, just gossip. You can imagine the kind of conversations that were essentially transpiring around him. They were of great, great importance. So like the great literature of the times, the great policy making, decisions that were being made in Delhi. What are the ramifications of that happening in, say, rural agrarian Vidarbha, Marathwada in those days when data was not so available. So that must be kept aside, in mind, that here is someone who has inherited that great big tradition that is, Maharashtra is so proud of, the Kosambis and, what have you. So that is one aspect of it. The second thing was, like a lot of people of that generation, there was a certain disillusionment with what we call now Nehruvian socialism, right? So independence had been got, there was great expectations. And then obviously, this was the transition of power where the shift happened between Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi. So that entire phase was happening, and a lot of people started, being disillusioned and also disappointed with what the Indian state was going to offer. We were supposed to be, forget this whole thing that we are talking now of being a great global power, 5 trillion economy, but we were supposed to be the pinnacle of human civilization in that sense, that we offered hope to the rest of, the countries in the 20th century, because on the one hand you had USSR, on the other hand you had the US. Anyway, that happened. And then in the 70s, when Madam Gandhi was the Prime Minister, I think at that point of time, a few things happened which I think personally disturbed him a lot. One was the mass-scale, rigging that happened in elections, be it in Bihar, be it in West Bengal, and so on and so forth. And then secondly, of course, the war with Bangladesh. And the third was, of course, the rampant use of violence, and Indian society had seen this happen in the 20th century with British colonial power. Now, for the first time, you see the Indian state unleashing it on its own people. And he, I think around that time, he reflects, because I didn't know him at that time, but one of the things that he said was that this is a rehearsal for fascism. Because you are seeing, so, for example, you had JP and you had all these people, the voices had started being, we had started hearing, but a lot of the crushing down was basically on student politics. Precisely an action replay of what is transpiring now. The very, very same thing. You take the proper nouns out of the equation and, everything else is the same. How
what
media...
Yeah.
So what... society plays like that. History is always, there is always a history and then there's a history below that history. So it's not, we tend to, believe in these simple narratives about everything. So one of the things, as I mentioned, he said is that what happened in the 70s was a huge eye-opener, because it also gave us a very, very clear indication of what is possible when fascism takes over, when a state becomes fascist in the true sense of the term. You hear stories of some of the very, very important leaders today, the socialists who are now heads of their own respective states, which are in power either in Delhi or in their own respective states. They were the very people who were crushed by the, the state governments then. So this is something that was going on. Now, if you recall that previous episode, all this churning is going on. And ultimately, as a master craftsman, you have to put all this on stage. So then, of course, you select your characters, your plots, your stories. You also look at the reality of what is happening on stage in Mumbai, Maharashtra at that time. And then you select how you're going to strategize and, channelize this, fermenting that is transpiring. So this is essentially that period between 69-70 onwards, all right? And as always, as is happening now, you have a great big middle class, which, ideally should have, because he himself was a member of that particular class and, society. And he could see what was transpiring, and he was just wondering why 99% of the people have been so mesmerized and hypnotized, and they're not even willing to question. And those who are willing to question are then, labeled as dissenters or anti-national or whatever. The same narratives, because people were being locked up without charge, without, non-bailable offenses and so on. So this was basically, what is transpiring. And it is not just him. There were also other great, writers, great authors who were doing this. In that time also, like, for example, Renu, he returns his Padma Shri. The same thing that happened about a few years ago when, great authors were returning their awards. You had the great Nagarjun saying something like, Beta banaye kar, maa banaye sabko bekar. So those kind of things. Again, the same narratives that are happening right now. So something was happening in Bihar, something was happening in Gujarat, where you again had student politics of the, and where the present Prime Minister has emerged from that movement, which was against the fascism of that time. And of course, Tendulkar Sahab in this corner of the world. So things are connected. It's not as if, you have an author in working in isolation and deciding that on behalf of 1 billion Indians will, challenge the state. It's many people who are feeling this turmoil and unrest. And somewhere I think authors, poets especially, and playwrights, they have the, they're conscience keepers in a way. So they are hopefully willing to, brave it out, speak the truth, and he did it, yeah.
But these individual people, so I'm digressing for a minute.
Sure,
these individual great playwrights or poets, they had their own opinion, they had their own stand. So how was the collaboration happening? Because if this nuance is transferred, maybe there are people in different parts of the country who are moving right now to certain sort of, they are responding to what's happening right now. So if they have to collaborate, and like what was happening then? So was, say, Tendulkar Sahab speaking to someone in Nagpur or
no, so again so there are three things. One is that you have a party which is backing you. So typically it could be, for example, in those days the left was considered to be a good space for progressive writers to do. Say, for example, IPTA was, broadly associated with CPIM in those days. So it would be that kind of a thing, that you are a cultural organization doing plays, protest songs, etc., but backed by a political party. Alternatively, you are somebody, like a Tendulkar Sahab, but you have a loose confederation of intellectuals, academics, activists, trade unionists, etc., who are working with you, which is a fairly formidable body, So that happens because somebody would be, fighting a case in court, somebody else would be giving a talk in the university campus, etc. But you are articulating the same concerns on stage. So it is, when we are saying multiple voices, it means multiple voices in civil society. It just doesn't mean those kind of things. And then the third is, of course, the audience, which is participating in all this. And then they're picking up, because it is also, in a way, sort of impacting what is transpiring in their day-to-day lives, right? Inflation, price hikes, tomorrow suddenly a bank goes bust. And, your money, unemployment was huge, because the same crisis that is transpiring now about unemployment among the youth was what was transpiring then. And the young generally, if you look at the youth movement of what transpired post-Vietnam in America, as well as what transpired in the West Bank and in Europe and Germany and so on, was the same thing. It was basically the young who were, in a way, saying enough of this rubbish, enough of the status quo, and, this cannot carry on any further, and we question you. And the fundamental truth about any questioning is that, you see, everybody says we are questioning the government, or we are questioning, a particular multinational or a conglomerate. The first premise that, as Socrates taught us, was that when you start asking questions, you need to know the facts. You cannot just start asking questions. You need to know where the money is coming from, where the money has been invested. So for that, then you have to start doing the work, right? On homework on it. So if, for example, tomorrow I start questioning 370, I start questioning triple talaq, I start questioning Ayodhya, I have to read at least 1,000-page documents on each of these, listen to the arguments on both sides, and then arrive at a particular conclusive, point of my own, and be ability to ask questions. So that is something the youth started realizing in their wisdom, that when we start asking these questions, this is A, the amount of hard work that we were doing, and B, this was what was happening. The moment they didn't have answers to our questions, repression. You see, so it was repression then and repression now as well. It's when the questions become very uncomfortable that the repression becomes the most volatile.
So I won't generalize. Obviously, in the voices which are heard today are well researched, but I guess with Tendulkar Sahab, it was very deep learning, research, and then questioning.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's always strategies. You see, different people have different strategies. Sometimes art provides it. Sometimes politics provides it. You see, so it is always what succeeds at that moment, and more importantly, what people remember. Right.
Yeah. Actually, I'll have a small plug here because when the demonetization happened and the new 2000 rupee note came in, I think some agency in Goa wrote a very big article as to how the notes are badly designed. And I was so not angry, but I was feeling very helpless to make people understand that this is like just a commentary on the superficial aesthetics of the note, right?
True.
It's pink color, whatever. And nobody has gone really into the depths of, is it braille friendly? Is it like what sort of cotton and zinc and magnesium is mixed to make that? What's the fraud? So you talk about the deeper cases of coming up to that solution as opposed to like superficially, Swachh Bharat logo is blur. I mean, blur is not even a concern here, right?
True.
So,
no, I'm talking of demonetization. No, it's a fair point. So as you know, I'm besides doing my playwriting and so on, I've also been associated with the print industry, right? So one of the things we know about the 8th December, and this is conclusive evidence, is that there was a shortage of paper, you see. And any print job, forget, even it's a small thing like a ticket for a play, or even a book being designed, or a poem, or even entry passes for something. There is a planning stage, you see. You always work backwards in time, that you get your templates right, you get your sizes right, and then you look at the availability of paper stock, inks, where is it going to be done, and then of course the poor man who's ultimately the supervisor, a press operator, he's going to be responsible for these things. In this particular case, because they were trying to keep the whole thing so secret and hush-hush, because they were afraid that if it gets leaked out. So I'm told that only 7 or 8 people were privy to this knowledge of this particular, demonetization going to happen. As a result, what transpired is that you have some of the best manufacturing plants in India which are capable of printing currency. But the people who are manning those operations, they are not aware of what is going to happen, what is going to be the demand supply, that requirement that is there. And so therefore there was a huge crisis for 3.5 months, I'm told. So much so that there's talk of, paper being shipped in, flown in by chartered planes. There's talk of, paper the currency being printed in De La Rue, which is a, UK-based currency plant, which basically manufactures currencies for a whole lot of other countries, including Pakistan and some of the other countries in Africa. So this is the nature of thing, right? Now, as a concerned citizen, forget the politics of all this. I should just know that what was the cost of this operation and why were we so unprepared, you see. If you're not going to trust your own operation manager who's manning and running those presses, then there's something fundamentally wrong, right? He's a technical guy. He needs to know what has to be done. It's like a cook in a chef in a 5-star. You have invited 1,000 people, but you have forgotten to inform him. So he has not organized any of the ingredients, and suddenly at 7 in the evening you say, okay, aaj 8 baje dawat hai, aap khana tayar karna. Unfair, very unfair. And it's unfair on the Indian citizen, I feel.
Yeah, I understand like this, the insights which you provide, and obviously documenting like a legend like Tendulkar Sahab.
Sure.
It would be there's no time limit to that, but so I want to understand what was his trajectory of him expressing, say, violence or whatever his agitation was against the establishment throughout his plays. The most Gidhade probably would be like a surge in his expression. And then obviously there's huge body of work, but one which is more familiar, say Kamala. So from that to there, was it increasing, was it decreasing? And I wanted like to ask you this because in one of the interviews with which is online with Vasantrao Deshpande.
Oh, okay.
He said, no, it's Pula Deshpande and Vasantrao Deshpande talking.
Okay.
And he said ki आता तुमच्या वयाबरोबर ती जी उसळती ताण आहे ती कमी होते का काय होते, आणि ते जर कमी होते तो देन ही आस्क की का, वयामुळे का विचारांमुळे. तो दॅट इज द प्रिमाइस विच आय वॉन्ट टू आस्क की as he grew, was the agitation more, or was it the...
So it's not a question of agitation. I mean, we can discuss specific plays, which I think we'll come to. But I think there were 2-3 things that he was, consciously suggesting, that there is a certain facade, there is a certain hypocrisy with the middle class, right? So, for example, there is all this data that emerged in, I think, 4 years or 5 years ago, this, post Nirbhaya, when there was the incident that transpired in Delhi and so on, and then there was this whole thing of sexual assault. So one is reported and one is unreported, and then you come to know that in the unreported, it's about 95% of it is within the family, within the household. So obviously there is some huge level of cruelty and violence which is transpiring within those 4 walls, which, because we are Indian society, to a large extent remains hidden, and because मुंह किसको दिखाएंगे, फिर लड़की शादी के लिए तैयार, all these sort of cultural assumptions and traits that were there. So this sort of hypocrisy that existed in sort of middle class society was something that Tendulkar was very, very critical about, consciously, and some people said even more than he should have. So, you always have playwrights which are always questioning, and they have 2 or 3 of broad themes. This was definitely one of the themes in his particular life. And then, I gave you that instance of Arthur Miller and, formally doing something with that verbal, documentation through the record. So that was something that he started doing at that point of time, because he was also associated with CJP and all these organizations. He came to know of what was happening with under trial prisoners in our Indian prisons. So he did a documentation in 72-73, and this was along with the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship. And basically what it entailed him to do was a couple of things. He could spend some time very consciously and visit Indian prisons, and then talk to those prisoners who were charged with capital punishment of some kind, and either it was a sort of murder or whatever, or a manslaughter and so on. And then he would have these long conversations with those people inside the prison. And then his idea was, it was not a vicarious thing that I want to know how perverted they were, or what was the deviancy in their mind and so on. And so he essentially was trying to understand that how normalized everything is, in today's thing. And there was this sort of 1 or 2% trait of violence which happened, or in some cases it so happened that it was so subconscious or unconscious. So this was the nature of documentation. And I recall he used to then do this 3 to 4 hour talk, which was in public domain, where he would speak, and he showed us in those days, that world of PPT, where he would show and tell, literally walk through about 20-25 of these cases and give us a little insight into each of the conversations that he had. He'd given a talk, I recall, in Mumbai, and at that point of time he sort of spoke about a couple of things, which I'll just share those 2 anecdotes. This is a published speech. It's a little booklet which somehow has disappeared from the planet, so this might be sort of a rare gem for your readers. He was, again, people forget about him, is he was a very good storyteller. So 2 things he managed to do. One was make you very comfortable, and then weave this magic of words in which, you've never heard stories like this. So it was like your Nana Nani ki kahaniya, like, what your grandmother would tell you in the good old days, except these would be really gruesome stories, right? Mm-hmm. So there were 2 stories that he used to talk about one was when he was a child in Kolhapur, and then subsequently he used to live in Mulund. So he had wandered around Mumbai a fair bit, moving from house to house. So the first one, I'll just read out what was there in that talk. It was the 1930s. Tendulkar was a teenager in Kolhapur. The breaking news was a man had killed 7 family members with an axe. Crowds had gathered. The police refused to enter the old single-storied chawl. Such was the fury of the killer. More and more people in Kolhapur joined the crowds. Then the military was called to maintain law and order. There was no photograph of the killer, but the special afternoon editions eulogized the events. Booklets, which were biographies, were sold. In the evening, they made a statue of the killer. This statue was of mud. It was created and then felicitated. Villagers from neighboring villages arrived in their bullock carts. Soon the site became a yatra sthal. A cold-blooded killer became a hero of our times. Why? So this is what Tendulkar had shared. And the second one was when he was in Mulund, and he used to stay alone in those days. He had just arrived in Mumbai, and I think he was staying solo. Then Tendulkar spoke about the time he was a tenant in Mulund, where he lived in a single-storied barrack-like brick chawl. Now this is, remember, in that era of Mulund, when not today's Mulund, where you have the high-rise and you have the the Godrej factory complexes. So Tendulkar worked in a newspaper. It was a no-moon night, a night of the dacoits. There was darkness. Tendulkar was enveloped by fear. No one in the vicinity. He locked the door and extinguished the kerosene lamp. Stifling silence. He heard voices. He peered through a keyhole. The voices moved on. Then he recognized the movement of the local Mali. So he stepped out to relieve himself. Then Tendulkar and the Mali spoke all through the night. Tendulkar, the journalist, asked the questions and the Mali replied. The tone matter of fact. The face like a statue. The Mali spoke about his past. How he bootlegged, the dacoitry, the number of murders he committed. No pride, no claims, no drama. Next morning, when Tendulkar was leaving for work for his journalist office, the Mali was watering the plants. He was humming a well-known patriotic song. So, who is a murderer? What is cold-blooded? Define crime. So this is, to answer your questions, I think these two anecdotes should suffice. I mean, there are many more, but these two would, I think, help.
Beautiful. So some of his, actually, I don't know, I don't have a count. Out of 27, I think 19 were censored. Yeah, something like that. I don't, this could be factually wrong.
Yeah.
But a lot of plays were censored, right? So what made him write so boldly despite being censored and continue to do that?
So few things. One is like the work itself. I'll just recount because I think this is something we should share when we talk of body of work. And and today you have people like me who claim to have body of work. But listen to Tendulkar. It is 28 full-length plays, 7 collection of one acts, 6 collection of children's plays, 4 collections of short stories, 3 collections of essays, a novel, 17 film scripts. And this was just 50 years, right, of work. So, plus, of course, talks and then things like what I just mentioned, this Nehru Fellowship, plus the work that he did with CJP and a whole lot of other things.
And columns, too.
Of course, yeah. So, journalism is separate because, he's doing day to day. It's like a 9 to 5. That was his bread and butter. So, again, people tend to forget that he used to earn as a journalist, and playwriting was sort of incidental increment, and whatever money I think he's received, I've heard fabulous stories of his magnanimity where he has landed up in the house of someone absolutely obscure and just distributed money, which I'm sure he's got from royalty or copyright or whatever. He's given money to translators and he has given money. See, and this is a talent. He has gone and given money to enemies, people who have abused him in public and who have destroyed his reputation. You would hear a story of him and just land up because that person is suffering from cirrhosis of the liver, and he will just go and in those days offer 50,000, 1 lakh, and completely without any drama, meaning not that there are 10 press people behind him and so on. He would go. Later you will hear this story from that person, not from Tendulkar. Tendulkar maintained a stoic silence in all this. So this, I think, is a remarkable thing that you see, you forgive your enemies, or not forgive your enemies. Enemies is too harsh a term, but you are accepting of counter views. Anyway, coming back to your specific questions, again, I can give you innumerable instances. But one big lesson that we learned from Tendulkar, and I think this would help you, is that his battles with the censor board are well known. And typically it's, it comes back to that whole student politics thing. You're asking fundamental questions which are meant to be asked. You see, as part of any civil society, as part of any evolving society, we have to ask this question. You have to ask these questions of the media. You have to ask this question of the courts. You have to ask this question of the people who are governing the land, whether it is, bureaucrats, whether it is politicians, whether it's our industrialists and so on. So these questions have to be asked. Now, obviously, because these are to a large extent uncomfortable questions, people do not want you to answer. So the first thing is clamp down, you silence. All right. So say in the case of Sakhārām Binder, when it happened, and if you read Kamlakar Sarang's well-documented book on it. I think that's fabulous. Or even what transpired later with Ghāshirām. The sort of reaction from society will emerge. So one of the lessons we learned from Tendulkar, and I'll keep this short, is that you see for example, in the case of Sakhārām, there was this thing of, the abuses, because Sakhārām is that kind of a character. He emerges from the bastis, and the play starts off with 4 wonderful expletives and, so on and so forth. So the first thing that the censor board wanted was to, snipe those off. So when we had sort of interacted with Tendulkar much later, he said that, look, they will do what they have to do. We have to do what we have to do. That was number one. And secondly, he says that if you need to, as part of the colloquial idiom of a character, include something, then my suggestion to all of you is add whatever you're doing X into 4X. So even if they cut what they cut, you will get what you want. All right. So he said that the point is not to start getting too worked up and hassled, because a lot of people do get very hassled. You see, usne mere play ka ya mere masterpiece ka 2 line kaat diya ya what have you, which is genuine. I'm not saying that it's a fake thing, but you said, as an artist, you have to be combating that. Today you're living in a particular kind of society in India, and you're fighting with certain kind of orthodoxy or certain kind of very rigid understanding of what theatre and art should be, right? So how do you combat that? One is you sit and keep having an argument. You don't have time for that, right? You want to write your next play. Your job is not to sit there and start having argument with the chief of censor board over, 4 days, 5 days of tea or what have you. So then you just find a way of just either you beat the system, basically. So that is a lesson I think one has learned from him. And constantly there has been a tussle, either with a formal censor or from civil society. So again, there's a very interesting book by somebody called Deepak Ghare, who has written about the journey of Ghāshirām. And that is actually what transpired with the play production. Right from the time when Tendulkar read the play to the members of PDA, how there was a split between the sort of, the orthodox conservative part of the group and the young rebellious part of the group, and how there were 2 diametrically opposite opinions about the play, and then how the split happened within the group PDA, the split that happened in Pune Brahmin Society, and then the reaction, and then of course how the play was mounted, how Jabbar used to come from Daund. He was a doctor, and in the middle of his practice he would take a train, come to Pune, rehearse the play with the members, go back to his thing. Satish Alekar used to help out with that. And then finally the big controversy, the play was to go to Berlin for a festival. In those days it was a very prestigious thing, and the Shiva Sena in those days, which was under the leadership of Bal Thackeray, had said that no, this play is an insult to the Peshwai society over here, and it's a criticism and critique of Shiva Sena. So we will not let this play go because it sort of rebukes Indian society. And then what happened? The behind the room, the backroom strategies, the meetings, etc. And finally that Air India flight which was taking off. How about, because you see, if you remember Ghāshirām, it has got a huge cast. So it is not as if 100 people can land up at the airport, because the Shiv Sainik said that we will not let these people go. So how some of them came in on a scooter, somebody was taken right to the runway, somebody landed up incognito, because Shiv Sena controls the trade union at the airports, right? So they were controlling the thing. So the entire Theatre Academy team had to come in 1s and 2s in sort of incognito, right? And then finally they sneak into this plane and the plane takes off. And when the plane takes off, how they all start singing songs from Ghāshirām as a part of the celebration. It's a great story, right? Of how these, so when we talk of standing up and things, it's these simple things. Theatre people have, these are all the tools we have. It's not as if we can always, do a mass demonstration or something. Ultimately, the show must go on, and that's what they did. So there's a little book by Deepak Ghare. It's a thriller. One must read it.
Definitely. Wow, it's so brilliant. Moving on to the last question of this section, of this part. So you mentioned that 4x, you show 4x, right? And I want to have a plug here again, because I somehow try and hoping that the listener base is design focus as well. And one which is, I don't know, I've not theoretically understood, but just from an experience standpoint, I've realized this, that even when you are standing for something against the business or something against the marketing team, being a designer, you you know that there is some sort of a dependency to run the business. So you have to let go certain battles.
Of course.
But then in the battle which you're picking up, you stand like way too ahead of what is where you have to land. So 4x wala x I can clearly map there. But that is dangerous in the today's time, right? So the question is mainly that what is the one thing which a young generation playwright or a like someone who wants to understand Tendulkar part A, and second is what were the conflicts or what were the things which can we avoid by looking at this person as well? Because a lot of time what happens is we look at the great part, but
course.
I'm sure when we speak to that person, he in his humble opinion will always say that I've made mistakes, I have to come up. So in that case, if we borrow certain inspiration from their
one good
parts,
thing that all playwrights should seek from Tendulkar, and one not so.
Yes.
So the good thing I think is write and write bloody good plays, because I think something we underestimate about the man, that he wrote and he could write anywhere. Like right now we are seated over here. If he was with us and he was told to sit on that broken chair and said, write, he will write. There will be no fuss about that. He could write anywhere and any place. And that is an extraordinary talent and ability, you see. We want atmosphere, we want the right thing, a coffee chahiye, whatever. I mean, there are certain idiosyncrasies everybody has. I had a remarkable, I think my last meet with him was when he was in Pune, and he, Ashok Kulkarni, who took very, very, very good care of him, had him in that, nursing home in Pune, where I think his last few days were in that place. And then close friends were informed that Sir is not sort of well, and I think I was one of them who went to visit him. Now, when one went him, he was not told to. He was not supposed to talk because that tired him. So what he would do was he would scribble notes, right, and then he would give it to you. Then you would read, and then you could. Now, for some reason, when I went to meet him, I don't know why this happened. I somehow assumed that even I had to reply scribbling notes. And this went on for quite some time. He's scribbling notes and he's this thing. And then finally, after about half an hour, Ashok, because the next person had to come, secondly, he had to be given rest. He comes to me and he says that, Are, you can talk, Ramu. There is no this thing on you. And I said, ho na, ya whatever. And then he said something interesting. No, let this be. It's after a long time that I'm enjoying writing again on, and that's the point I realized that was something that kept him going. I mean, forget this little anecdote and this and that, but the fact that he genuinely derived a lot of pleasure in writing, and that is something that has to happen. It's not something that you contrive to do, right? It's like, I know people who just enjoy listening to really great music, like a Mukul Shivputra or a Venkatesh Kumar in the morning. And, there is nothing greater that brings greater joy to them, or watering plants or what have you. So with Tendulkar Sahab, it was like that. Writing was like orgasm for him in the purest sense of the term. And he could do it anywhere and any place. And that I've really seen. There was there was something that was happening in Mulund, I think, at Kalidas, and we were in the wings. And something was happening on stage, and someone came to him saying, I want something. And while the program was going on, he had a little waiting time in the wings, about 15-20 minutes. He just asked for a piece of paper and something, and within that time, in very, very neat handwriting, he had written 2 pages out, which was given handwritten to that, and it got published in the next day's newspaper.
Wow.
So, I mean, of course, talent, craft, intelligence, all those things matter, but the fact that he could do it, and he always wanted to do it. The one thing that I suspect, and I say this with all sort of humility and whatever, without, any affront to him, is that the way he looked at, or the way his plays looked at women is something that I think we need to relook at today, because I think there is a certain kind of patriarchy. There is a certain kind of male vision to all his plays. Women are second nature, or at times even inferior in terms of how he has positioned them. And of course, there have been, huge discussions, lots and lots of articles and this is something we have discussed with him. You see, don't forget, this is again a state with a huge and very proud legacy of women tradition. You have Savitribai Phule, Tarabai Shinde, Pandita Ramabai. I mean, you name it. Innumerable great women who have walked on the soils of this particular land. So that was something that we always, used to ask him, that, considering that you have such a powerful progressive tradition of women independent autonomous thought, why such timid women or such regressive women in your plays? And of course, I mean, we had our ups and downs and afra-tafri about it. But the fact is that is something I feel needs to be re-looked at, rethought, recalibrated, whatever. Yeah.
I frankly don't have any I completely understand it's like a lifelong journey to understand such a great person. So I would just conclude by saying thank you for giving your time, and we'll conclude one piece which you have written.
That's right,
in the second episode. So thanks for this episode.
Thank you,
and thanks
Kedar
for
Bhau.
making it.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's it.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. Catch us on iTunes, Saavn, Stitcher or any podcasting app you use. Do rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Stay tuned for more Gyan on Audiogyan.com. Till then, bye.